Hello, this is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government. Just wanted to drop in and give you a couple updates on things that are going on. I think there's a lot of really important things that are happening today that are a little bit under the radar, and some aren't so much under the radar. So let's get going. An interesting kind of almost a man bites dog story. Amazon, liberal Amazon, Jeff Bezos's Amazon. Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, Amazon. Their headquarters is in Seattle, Washington. They have offices here in the DC area as well, but their main headquarters has been in Seattle. That's where they were founded. That's where their base is. And they just announced, believe it or not, they're going to be temporarily moving their 1,800 employees out of the Seattle area, out of their office, because they've got a crime wave going on around the Amazon office. They've got homicides on almost a daily basis. They have robberies. They have all sorts of societal woes are happening there at the Amazon office. And, remember, Seattle was a place that, was very active in defunding the police. They didn't crack down on the Antifa mobs. They allowed them to set up their own little city for a while. And, so Seattle, while they've changed the mayor's been changed since then. They have some significant problems because once you tell the police we're going to defund you, even if you don't fully defund them, police get the message that they are going to be the target rather than getting uplifted, being supported by the government. They'll be looked at as being anytime anything happens, they'll be guilty until proven innocent. And as a result, police in those circumstances police different. They don't stop people who are engaged in petty crimes. In fact, it's discouraged by the modern Democrat prosecutors, the Soros prosecutors. They don't go if they see somebody engaged in graffiti. They don't stop the person. They don't roust them a little bit, get them to stop doing that, because if something happens, they'll be wrong because they should never have confronted the person under the eyes of what the liberal prosecutorial group that's come out of the George Soros network believes. So you make it so petty crime is legal. You make it so, robbery, as long as it's under a certain amount, burglary is legal, defacing public property is legal, defacing private property is legal. And they're all legal, not because they changed the law. They're legal because they won't be prosecuted for doing it. And so Seattle, now Amazon, is sitting there, which is really one of the top, if not the top company in Seattle. And I would guess, given their market cap, they are the top company in Seattle. One has to guess that they're not in a crummy part of town. They're in a business district with a nice glass building. And yet Amazon is now saying it's too unsafe in Seattle for our employees to go to work. I mean, that's the state of Seattle, and quite honestly, and scarily, it's the state of the nation. We've seen over the last year, we have 100,000 people who died of opioid overdoses. 100,000 people. That's far more than what's happened in the Trump administration in 2018, 2019, when it was down below 70. We've seen a multiplier, 40% increase in drug overdoses. And it's largely because we have a wide open border. We have a wide open border, and the cartels, and Mark Morgan, who's the former head of border security, border patrol, has said we have an open border now, and that the cartels actually control our border on both sides, because our border patrol is hamstrung under this administration, which has absolutely no plan for controlling the border. And when you have no plan for controlling the border, then your plan is to not control the border. And that's what that's the Biden agenda, and that's what's happened. So we have the cartels in control of our border. We have the cartels able to run drugs across the border without much fear of being captured. We have people who are being run across the border while families and a lot of people may be tying up Border Patrol resources by turning themselves in at stations, knowing full well that they won't be returned. The people who the cartels want to get across the border, those people go across the border in more remote areas, and because those are the people who they're putting into place to run their business in our major American cities, in our medium-sized cities, and even our smaller cities. And so we have the cartel running a criminal enterprise, basically an organized crime effort across America, where they control both the production on their side of the border, the distribution from their side of the border to their retailers, and the retailers on the streets. And that's a recipe for bloodshed. That's a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe for a lot of dead Americans. And folks, the number one cause of death from people who are 25 to 34, number one cause of death is drug overdose. It's not COVID. It's not cancer. It's not car crashes. It's drug overdoses. 100,000 drug overdoses, deaths in this past year. Let's compare it to the crime wave that's happened with homicides. We've seen a large number of increase in homicides. In fact, the number has gone up is up to about 6.4 homicides per 100,000. That's equivalent to where it was around 1993. After a long kind of steady, there was a decline, and then it's kind of a trough of how many homicides were occurring in America. That trough got broken out of during the COVID crisis, as people were isolated, and we had the societal problems that occurred as a result of that. But when the judges and the prosecutors stopped putting people in jail, when they stopped doing the basic things of saying, if you use a gun, you go to jail, sentencing, as they sought to try to eliminate real penalties for those who are the most dangerous criminals amongst us. And quite honestly, they opened the prison doors for many people who were dangerous drug dealers, under the guise that they were only dealing marijuana. We opened those doors, and we have a significant increase in the crime rate in this country. But let's look at what the real number is. We have 100,000 drug overdoses in 2021. In 2021, we have between 19 and 20,000 homicides. You are 5 times more likely to die of a drug overdose than you are of a homicide. We're looking at people who are 18, who are the youngest. Our youngest population are dying of drug overdoses. And truthfully, homicides tend to skew young also. But so the question is, why is the Biden administration ignoring a scourge that has gone up by 30%, 35% in 2 years in terms of drug overdoses? And the answer is simple. They don't want to deal with the core problem. And the core problem is we haven't controlled our borders. And as a result, we're allowing the cartels, the Sinaloa cartel, the various cartels at our border, the Zeta cartel, who, by the way, get paid. They get paid to traffic people across our border. There's an estimate that 3 million people tried to cross our border last year. Well, and million and a half made it across. Fact of the matter is, every single one of those people, there may be some examples, but the vast majority of those people paid a cartel to get them there and to get them across. That's the reality. That's what's happening. And the average price of getting somebody across the border a year ago was around $7,000. So if you look at taking somebody who's poor, living in a place like Guatemala, and they're looking for a better life, and their parents say, you need to go north, there's no jobs here. You essentially sign an indentured servitude to the cartel, promising to pay back the money, so that you pay some up front, you scrape together what you can, and then you take your family's life savings and to get north. And then you pay the cartel off, and you get here, and then you constantly have to keep paying them. This is a huge source of revenue for the cartels. In fact, it's been a number of people have contended who are in the actual world of border patrol and drug interdiction, that the human trafficking pays the cartels far better than the drug trafficking. And because once they get people here, they essentially then charge them money to be able to send money back home, So they're constantly getting a take off of every single transaction that person makes when they try to send money back to help their family back home. So we were looking at the drug cartels controlling our border, the drug cartels shipping massive amounts of lethal drugs, fentanyl as a primary example, and killing 100,000 Americans due to drug overdose. And yet the Biden administration sits idle. We're looking at, and there's no, let's just be honest, on the homicide rate, it's really sad that it's going up. But it's going up because once again, at the city level, it went up, started going up when our city officials started attacking the legitimacy of our police forces. When the city officials said, we can't have strict enforcement of our laws because you have over incarceration under those circumstances. And so when they certainly went after police, so it created an environment where a police officer is afraid to actually do their job, because if they do their job, somebody's going to have on camera that they were stopping a crime, that they were getting in the way of a criminal, and the fight that ensues, and that camera will always look like the cop's wrong. And so they're sitting there afraid to actually do their jobs. They're not willing to put their pensions on the line, not willing to put their livelihoods on the line, not willing to put their freedom on the line to actually enforce the laws of the city, because they know that the city won't back them up. And in places like Los Angeles County, the sheriff of LA County, a place where they don't issue concealed carry permits, at least hadn't in the past, has essentially told citizens, I will issue, if you live in LA County outside the city, if you live in LA County, I will issue concealed carry permits for you, because we can arrest the criminals, but before they get the paperwork done, the criminals back out on the street. And there's instances of one person getting arrested 7 independent times in one day. And we took up more sheriff's resources to arrest that person, fill out the paperwork, and took sheriff's resources off the street, while that person was basically booked, photographed, and shipped out the door 7 times in 24-hour period. That one person was arrested, and they clearly weren't spending any time actually in the jail facility. And that's an extreme. That's not all that far from the extreme, because if you commit a crime in California and if you steal something and it's under $900 in value, guess what? It's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony anymore. So guess what's happening? A lot of people are stealing stuff knowing that they're not going to get a felony charge. And once you get used to stealing stuff and breaking the law, once the law, that line, the fabric of society is torn, then it's very easy to take the next step and do something that's really heinous. But that's what's happening in our cities. That's what's happening because of war on police. And that's what's happening as a result of prosecutors who refuse to prosecute crimes. And it's a Biden administration that won't do the basic job of a nation, of a government, which is to protect its borders. And I'm sure it isn't lost on all of you that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and others have made a big deal about the sanctity of the Ukrainian borders. And I'm not disagreeing. The Ukrainian borders should not have been breached by Russia. But doesn't it seem a little odd that they're more concerned about Ukrainian borders than they are our own? They're more concerned about what happens in Ukraine rather than the 100,000 people who die of drug overdoses. It's not, you can't have one and the other. And as much as, and Kamala Harris, of course, put in charge of Ukraine, cackling her way through Europe a couple of weeks ago, it's really, wouldn't it be nice if she spent any time at the border? If we actually had a border policy that the Biden administration said, this is a problem, we can't have fentanyl flowing across our borders and killing our kids. Wouldn't it be nice if that was the Biden administration policy, where they were aggressively going after this problem that they created? At least they exacerbated. Well, of course it would be. But now because they have effectively stopped pressuring Mexico. The government of Mexico is doing nothing on their side of the border to help. In fact, the government of Mexico is being problematic in terms of helping. There's a rule now that we have to actually the drug enforcement agencies, if they want to go into Mexico, they now have to report to the Mexican law enforcement the exact things they're going to do. What does that mean? It means that the drug cartels know what's happening before it ever happens, because the Mexican system's corrupted. Their law enforcement system is corrupt. And it's been infiltrated by the cartels, as one would expect. It's not a surprise. Everybody knows it. But the fact that we allow that to occur, so we can't go after the worst of the worst, the people who are responsible for the deaths of 100,000 Americans. And this is not to dismiss the fact that everybody has a responsibility. And if you put drugs in your arm or you snort it, whatever, that's a choice you make. And as a choice, it's a bad choice. But I don't think anybody thinks that choice should be a death penalty, should be a death sentence. And I know people who struggle with drug addiction, and they do everything they can to try to overcome it. And quite honestly, they just can't, and they die. So this is a passion issue. You cannot say that you have compassion for people and then allow the drug cartels to continue to have free reign of sending fentanyl across this border. You just can't. And yet that is the position the Biden administration attempts to take. On a related subject, on the crime rate and on the increased crime rate, the answer of the left and of the Biden administration and of people who write articles on it, who, you get some criminologists from some university saying, well, we've got this increased crime rate, increased homicide rate. If we only banned guns, wouldn't that be jolly? Well, folks, I think the absurdity of that's clear. If you are going to push for defunding the police and banning guns, effectively you want the American populace to be sheep amongst wolves who've been allowed to enter our country to actually go after people and kill people and take their stuff. So it's never been more clear that the same people who wanted to defund the police were cheering when the Ukrainian government was giving out machine guns to their populace. It's never been more clear that people who wanted to defund police were always, when the resultant increased crime rate occurred, it was always obvious that those people were going to call for banning guns as the solution, even though places with wide open carry, with concealed carry laws, what we find is people who legally are carrying firearms don't commit crimes. What we find is the crime rate I could just go back to my experience as a lobbyist for National Rifle Association at state level back in the late 80s, early 90s. The crime rate in Florida, when we passed the concealed carry law in Florida, the homicide rate plummeted from the 87 to 95. It plummeted. And it plummeted for a very good reason. The criminals understood that if they tried to attack a person on the street, that person could be armed. And there was a high likelihood they were armed. And as a result, the criminals didn't do that anymore. The proof of that was within a couple of years, they had a big problem in Florida. Their license plates used to designate whether you're a rental car or not. And the criminals knew that if you were in a rental car, you didn't have a concealed carry permit. And it's very unlikely that you had a gun available to you. And so along some of the major thoroughfares from international airports, the gangs would throw nails out in the road, blowing tires on rental cars. And when a rental car pulled aside and it was isolated, they'd run out and rob the people. And that was what was happening in Florida. And so a few short years after they passed the concealed carry law, they passed a law that took away the designation of whether it was a rental car or not off their license plate, because they saw their visitors, their tourists, were being targeted by gangs who knew that they were not able to defend themselves. That tells you criminals are rational. Criminals don't want to confront somebody who can shoot them back. And that's why the homicide rate went down in Florida to levels that hadn't been seen since 1963. from the height of the Don Johnson, Miami Vice era to cutting those homicide rates significantly and to levels that existed for 20, 30 years prior to the 60s and 70s when crime kind of took a major jump. So, was allowing people to carry guns the sole thing? No, they tightened up criminal sentences. They did other things, but it certainly played a huge role because the criminals knew that the people weren't sheep waiting to be fleeced. And as a result, they had a decision to make of whether they were willing to lose their life to steal your watch. And the decision that was made repeatedly was, no, I'm not willing to. And that, my friends, is real criminal interdiction by making it so the American populace are not sheep, and that the wolves out there are scared because the animal they might be attacking just might be a lion. So that's a little story. Scott Taylor, I remember 30 years ago, I was 9 years old. Seattle was such a beautiful place, clean place relative to other major metropolitan areas. We visit Seattle often to Gasworks Park, the fish market downtown. The fish market is pretty cool. They throw the fish at you, or they throw the fish around. Out to eat near or on the pier. Today, I wouldn't dream of taking my children anywhere near downtown Seattle. Isn't that a sad state of affairs? I mean, what a sad state of affairs. Yeah, Seattle is on Lake Washington. It's a beautiful city. It's really picturesque. It's it's almost like a Hallmark movie in some ways, in the way it looks. But but the sad thing is, just even before this crime wave, 5-6 years ago, they did a study of the clams and of the oysters and other shellfish, oysters and mussels, I guess, in the Puget Sound. And what they discovered was that there was a high toxicity level amongst those mussels and clams. Because the mussels and clams they're bivalves, and what they do is they basically eat the muck. They siphon the bad stuff out of the muck, and they eat whatever's in the muck that they want to eat. And so what was happening was the Seattle homeless population, which has been growing and growing and growing, were using drugs. They were expelling drugs out of their system on the streets, and that was being washed into the Puget Sound. Those shellfish were then consuming those drugs through their process of eating, and so they became toxic. They end up having actually, you could track the increase in drug usage and the number of street people based on the toxicity of those clams and oysters, and mussels, I guess. So what are you looking at? Essentially, an area that's a protected area, an EPA kind of protected area, was being destroyed because Seattle had a homeless policy which invited homelessness. They gave away free needles. They enabled the homeless population and the drug addict population to freely use those drugs. And as a result, they're one of the most precious resources, which is the wildlife in the Puget Sound, the fish and community in terms of clams, oysters, mussels. That really got destroyed. And I once told somebody, you really ought to file an EPA complaint against them for their homeless policy, because they are in fact in violation of EPA by what they're allowing to flow into the Puget Sound, untreated waste. And that's the reality of a homeless population. And folks, that's why Scott says it's such a terrible waste, because Seattle is, on its face, Seattle's a beautiful city, and only liberals could ruin it. Helen Bennett, I'm so tired of evil people. Yeah, Helen, it's unfortunately the fallen condition of man is the way it is. The problem is so many of our people who, the government is set up in some respects we all have rights. The government is set up so others aren't encroaching upon our rights. So that's what a civil society is. And those who believe that we should have no enforcement of those laws like the laws against petty theft and going into a 7-Eleven and filling up your bag with stuff off the counter, off the shelves, and walking out and saying, "Gee, that's just a misdemeanor." People who think that's compassionate and helpful, those people are the ones who are breaking down the civility of our society, and they're doing it deliberately because they're trying to create an uncivil society, because then America has to fail. Because if none of us are on the same team, if all of us are suddenly in a wrestling match with each other, knowing that our property is not protected, knowing that our hard work is no longer valued, and in fact, somebody can take it from us and face no penalty, why would you work hard? Why would you contribute to society in those kinds of ways? Why would you be economically productive if you could steal this stuff and not have any penalty versus working your tail off to make a living and to make stuff? And the answer is a lot of people wouldn't. And that's when society breaks down, and that's what we're seeing in Seattle. Yeah, Roz, they are succeeding. But you know what? The fact of the matter is, most Americans are outraged by this. And I know that particularly in the opioid crisis, it touches people all over the country. This is not an urban problem. It's not a suburban problem. It's not a rural problem. It's an American problem. And so many families have been touched and know somebody who's died of drug addiction, of drug overdose. And the truth of the matter is, this idea that it's we see the sidebar problems. We see people want to talk about homelessness as a problem. Homelessness is a problem, but homelessness isn't a problem of a property problem. Certainly, having housing can help homelessness, but the fact is, homelessness is actually more a drug problem. And if you don't deal with the underlying drug addiction problem, homelessness can't be dealt with. And one of the things that we see, and I'm going to flash back to when I was worked at the city of Los Angeles when I was a senior at the University of Southern California. And I used to park on Skid Row and walk up the street to City Hall, where I worked at the Recreation Parks Department. And I'd walk up there every single day and walk back every single day through Skid Row. And there were people there who were just gone. They were just gone. And it was the same people every single, and it was heartrending. And to this day, I see one guy who would sit there and he was totally zoned, and he would just make twitchy motions with his hands all day long. He would do them when I was walking up in the morning. He'd do them when I was walking back in the evening. Same place, didn't move, was just stuck in a loop. There was no help for him. There's no help for them because the ACLU, during the Ronald Reagan years, came in and filed a court case and said, you can't take people who are homeless off the streets unless you can charge them with a crime. And as a result, the state of California was compelled by the Supreme Court to dump the homeless population, dump the drug addicts, the mentally impaired, onto the streets, unless there was some reason to have them put into a criminal facility or into a mental health facility. And as opposed to going around like in Andy Taylor and in Mayberry, going around and picking up Otis because Otis isn't doing so well and putting him in the jail overnight. The fact is, Otis was getting something to eat in the jail. And Otis, of course, you remember the show. Otis seems like he had eaten plenty in his life. But the fact of the matter is, there's not a capacity under the law to actually treat these people compassionately. And it's not compassionate to leave them on the streets. It's not compassionate to not give them a chance to recover their lives. That's not compassionate. But government fails every step of the way. And the answer truly is in the church. And the answer is in private initiative. The answer is for churches to get out and to help people get into recovery programs, to help people get food they need when they're struggling, The answer is for our churches to link arms and begin to be the social safety network that God intended them to be. You can get the government to do stuff and to help, but there's nothing like somebody who actually cares about a person's soul, about their human existence, about who they are, to be able to treat them as Jesus treated the leper and try to provide through God's grace the resources for healing and for restoration. And that's the job of the church. Government doesn't do that. Government, you're a number. To the church, you're a person. And we have to restore that. If we don't restore that relationship, recognizing the government fails, we have to restore that relationship where we take care of our brethren when they are fallen. And even in impossible situations, we try to provide them with a place where they aren't stuck out on the street, desperate, lost, scared and lonely. That's the thing to pray for, that our churches get restored, because the restoration of the church will help with the restoration of those who are most in need. Let's see what we have here. Sorry for the sermon. Why would anyone in their right mind vote Democrat? Well, I think that's a great question. Why would anybody in their right mind vote Democrat? Well, I think that one of the things that happens is the Democrats are very good at talking compassion. They're extraordinarily good at talking compassion. The problem is all their solutions are wrong, because the compassion that they always talk about is, let us, if we take over, if we're running government, we're going to put more money into this. And as a result, we're going to put more government people on it. And if you don't know any better, you think that might do something. And Republicans typically say, we're Americans for Limited Government. We say this, that we really need to cut these programs. We really need to stop the dependency cycle that eats at the moral soul of the individual and takes away all their dignity. We really need to provide people with opportunity and training and opportunity to be able to make it in the private sector rather than be dependent on the public sector. And to some, it seems compassionate to say, we're going to care for this person from cradle to grave. And in some small, very, very narrow instances, that may be true. But in most cases, the care provided by the government is care with strings. It's care with handcuffs. And it's care that's not designed to get you out of that care system. It's designed to keep you in that care system so you continually vote for the people who provide you with the funds. That's the Democrat. That's the golden handcuffs, or the velvet handcuffs that Democrats put on people who have needs. And it's not compassionate. It's about power. It's calculated. It's about power. And it's not about allowing people to be the people they are meant to be, the people God created them to be. It's not about that. It's about having a captive group of people who are dependent upon you for their very living, and who will vote whatever they have to vote in order to be able to survive, because they've been told and taught and trained that without the government, they cannot survive. And that's just not true in a vast majority of cases. Let's see here. So the problem has to be attributed to mental illness as well. However, drugs, alcohol causes mental illness. It's a bad circle. And this is Scott Taylor, by the way, and I agree with you. It's a bad circle, and the solution is going to be expensive for taxpayers, no matter which way you cut it. Somebody needs to take responsibility on a case-by-case basis and get these people the help they need. Maybe that's 1 year in jail, treatment facility, and then housing afterwards, job placement, etc. Yes, God is needed. I fought through addiction myself, and God was. I'm not, and that's where it ended. Okay, so yes, yes, but I will tell you a secret. And once again, this is The programs that work in terms of the best and that get less recidivism from prison are the faith-based ones. The recidivism rate is pretty much the same for programs that don't have, they really don't work. The programs that don't have God at their center, don't have Christ at their center. The ones that have Christ at the center have a much greater percentage of people who don't go back and commit new crimes. And the reason for that's relatively simple. Christ provides you purpose. Christ provides you meaning. And a government program that merely trains you to try to do something else, when the chips are down, you don't have anything else to fall back on. And so you fall back in old patterns. And folks, the chips, every life has rainfall in it. And some have torrents. And some people, some people are able to withstand the storms, and other people get, because of things that have happened, or get beaten down by them. Unless we help restore the soul, we cannot restore the person. And government programs attempt to restore the person while denying the ability to restore the soul. And so while, yes, government programs and things to deal with prison reentry and things like that are important, what's really important is what happens from the church. And folks, you can't take the money from the government, because the government forces you to take Jesus out of the equation. If you take government money, you can't have Jesus in the equation. So, if you want to have a program that works, if you want to interdict some of these problems, put Jesus at the center of this as a solution and let him do the work. I'm sorry, I must be in my evangelical mood, but when you deal with problems like this, it's hard to look at them and say that there's any other answer in many respects to most of the problems in the world. And I think the problems, the places where we see indigent populations, that government, we spent trillions of dollars on the war on poverty since 1965, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars on the war on poverty. And we lost the war on poverty, because poverty is worse today than it was before. We have more homeless today than it was in 1965. Our education levels are lower today than they were in 1965. We have created the government dependency cycle has created a perverse incentive to not teach our kids anything, to make people look at the government as being their salvation. And as long as people worship in the government, they've got their eyes placed on the wrong place. And so that's the challenge. Scott Taylor, eventually for me, I spent 10 months in jail. That got my mind clear so I could make a good decision. I chose Christ. Well, Scott, praise God. And it's thank you for sharing that. It is sometimes incarceration is what's needed to get somebody to figure it out. Unfortunately, everybody has their own path. But if you know somebody who's dealing with these problems, certainly get them help. Try to get them help in a place that's Christ-centered, because that has the best chance of being successful. But ultimately, that person has to surrender to Christ in order to be able to, and surrender in a lot of ways in order to be able to overcome these things. Because if they continue to fight addiction alone, addiction wins, and more times than not. And I know, and folks, I'm not going to talk about specifics, but youth group that I used to be the head of had some kids, and really just great kids, really smart kids. One of the kids he would have made a great youth leader. He got into drugs, and eventually, after going through treatment and being clean for a year, and he was clean for a year, and it took one time, and he was dead. It's a kid who had accepted Christ, who accepted Christ fully. And even in that circumstance, he he ended up essentially killing himself by putting a needle in his arm. The one thing that's kind of a salvation in that to me, kind of a saving grace, is that I know he's with Jesus and his pain is over. But so there are tragic stories that end in all sorts of different ways. I just know that the only way that you actually get out of this is by keeping your eyes on the cross. And it's just, historically speaking, it's not 100% that if you go to a Christian-based thing, it's going to work. A Christian-based treatment, it's going to work. But once again, this is about us taking back our country. And if it's about us taking back our country, you can't complain about too much government if you're not willing to replace the government. And the place to replace the government is in the basic human services that we can do, helping feed people, helping give people a place to, find a place to live, work to create a drug treatment facilities, or work to give people off the streets in whatever way we can. Obviously, there's people trained to know how to do that, but we have to link arms and figure out how and get ourselves involved in that. So we are then linked in this battle together, because if you rely on the government to provide compassion, you're not going, essentially, you're not going to end up solving the problem, because we've spent trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars on that compassion model, and it has failed, utterly and completely failed. Let's do the, I was going to talk about some other things, but I think we've kind of given the sermon for the day. One thing to note, this is on the producer price index. Inflation, once again, we had about a 10% increase on the producer price index for last month. It indicates that, there's more inflation on the way. Much of that was driven by food and energy. There's some indication that the Saudis that more oil is going to be coming out of the Middle East, and so the oil futures have dropped below $100 today, for $100 per barrel in the futures market. So we may end up seeing some measure of relief off the current highs that we're seeing. But the reality is, energy is the one thing that every single thing that happens in our economy is dependent upon. It's the one thing that everything's dependent on. If you're in a service sector, you're still driving to work. You're still using a computer. You're burning electricity. You're doing things which require energy to deliver your services. If you're making something, if you're making steel, it costs a huge amount of energy. Anything you're doing, it costs a huge amount of energy. So if you're producing goods, final goods were up over 2% month to month. That's 2%. That's 24% over the year. Now, maybe that goes down, and hopefully it does. We've all seen what's happening at the grocery store in terms of food prices. It's insane. But when you get down to it, when you have a government that refuses to produce domestic energy, refuses to have resilient, proven energy sources that are here, developed, when you have a government that says, well, Keystone XL pipeline wouldn't do any good because they won't be able to deliver any oil tomorrow. Well, if it had actually been built as opposed to blocked by the Biden administration in 2021, we may be in a position where the Keystone XL pipeline was part of the solution right now. So, you get down to it, and that's that's kind of the lesson of the day. Every time somebody says from government, well, that won't do any good right now. The fact is, that's the kind of thinking that says, no, we shouldn't build pipelines for the infrastructure that we need for tomorrow, because it's not going to help us today immediately. And that's planning to fail. That's making it so the problem will never be solved. It will always be a crisis. And their answer to the crisis is to have no energy at all, and instead be reliant on solar and wind and things that work when they work. And when they don't work, you better get used to being cold, very cold, or very hot. So that's that's their solution. Their solution is as Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg so famously said, when people talking about poor people who can't afford the gas to drive to work, and he just suggested to them, well, buy an electric car. That'll solve your problem. That's how far out of touch this Biden administration is. And folks, we just have to hold them accountable with the ballot box. But if you think they're incompetent, going back to the first point, if you think they're incompetent in dealing with everything, why would you allow them to deal with homeless? Why would you allow them to deal with a person, your loved one, who is struggling with addiction or homelessness? You wouldn't. No right-thinking person would let the Biden administration, the clowns in the Biden administration, be trusted with your loved one's health. So, why should we trust them with other people's loved ones' health? If we're going to love our man, we're going to love our neighbor, then we need to start taking responsibility and wrapping our arms around our neighbor and providing them with the help when they need it. And if we're not willing to do that, don't complain when government tries to do it for you. Anyway, that's what I got. I appreciate all you guys listening. Sorry for the lecture. I was like, I must have had a 5-hour energy right now or something. But I'm Rick Manning. We're President Americans for Limited Government. If you like, click on the little button and subscribe. To get notifications when these things are going to happen. Also, spread the word. If you think Americans for Limited Government is doing a good job, if you think we're useful and we're a helpful part of trying to be a solution to the problems we're having here in America, if you like what we're doing, subscribe to Daily Torch. Just put your email; it's free, and we'll get you something every single day on it. Secondly, spread the word. Send this around to friends. Send articles which we send out around to friends. The way we win in America politically is by taking the number of people who are currently involved in with Americans for Limited Government, it's about 100,000, and putting a zero to it. Because if we have 1 million people pulling on the oars, the fact is you can't be ignored. And that is what we're trying to do here, is grow. We grow through engagement, giving you ways to take action. And I hope that those things are helpful to you. Anyway, with that, I've taken enough of your time. Appreciate all you do, and just keep up the fight. And praise God that He's provided solutions when man's solutions fail. Take care, folks.